The summer of 2023 in suburban Pennsylvania was the absolute worst time of my life. It completely destroyed the sense of safety that took me years to build. That incident turned me into a paranoid person, terrified of the dark, and I never dare to stay alone in a closed room anymore. There are some raw, twisted truths about human nature that are far scarier than any ghost story out there. I had to live through it myself, with no way to explain why I was so careless. This fear didn't just disappear when I left that house. It dug deep into my subconscious, becoming a psychological shadow that has dragged on for the past 3 years. It all started when the lease on our old apartment ended. Gideon and I were under an immense amount of pressure to find a new place that fit our budget. Fortunately, a family acquaintance offered to let us rent an old, isolated house in Pennsylvania at an incredibly cheap rate. The house had been sitting empty for a while and needed a complete makeover before we could officially move our things in. Since Gideon had an unexpected business trip over the weekend, I decided to head out there a few days early by myself. I wanted to take advantage of the time to paint the walls and clean things up ahead of schedule. However, the very moment I stepped through the front door, an invisible sense of unease washed over me. The house was just too big for one person, filled with too many tight nooks, and it constantly made those characteristic creaks of old wood. When I called Gideon to complain about it, he just mocked me over the phone screen. He said in a teasing voice, "Every old house in America makes noises like that, babe. You're just overthinking it." His rational mindset made me feel a little less scared, but my intuition refused to settle down. I knew this house had been vacant for a few months after the previous owner passed away from old age. The interior was coated in a thin layer of dust and smelled heavily of rotting wood that hadn't seen human life in a long time. To shake off that gloomy atmosphere, I tried to refresh the space by blasting music and opening all the windows during the day. I started painting the living room walls, hoping a fresh coat of paint would make the place look a bit brighter. Even so, I wasn't completely alone in that house. I had brought Roscoe along, a cattle dog I raised since he was a puppy, who was incredibly smart. Roscoe was highly sensitive to strangers and always observed his surroundings in silence, never barking blindly. The house also came with a simple chime alert system attached to the front door. It would emit a rather piercing beep sound every time someone pushed the door open. Those safety measures temporarily gave me a false sense of security as I headed into my very first night. On that first Friday night, darkness fell incredibly fast in the secluded suburbs. Gideon called to let me know he had arrived safely at his work trip and wished me a good night. I did a walkthrough of the house, carefully locking all the main doors to ensure everything was secure. I put on the comedy show The Office on my laptop in the kitchen, just wanting the background noise to drown out the eerie silence of the massive house. My anxiety spiked as I realized there wasn't a single neighbor's light visible around us. Outside, there was only the wind whistling through the thick bushes, creating a gloomy atmosphere. Around midnight, I started hearing these faint rustling and clicking sounds. The noise had a steady rhythm, and it felt like it was coming from the ceiling or inside the double-layered walls of the hallway. Roscoe suddenly stood straight up from his dog bed. He didn't bark loudly, but just let out a low, soft growl from the back of his throat. Roscoe's ears pricked up, his eyes fixated on the metal grate of the air vent on the hallway wall. Clutching a flashlight, I slowly walked down the hallway and peered into the dark corners, but found absolutely nothing. I thought about grabbing a chair to climb up and inspect the vent closely, but the cold chill of the house made me hesitate. I ended up just lifting my phone to snap a quick picture into the darkness of the vent, then hurried straight to the bedroom. The rest of that first night passed without any other major disturbances. Even so, I barely slept a wink, constantly bolting awake every single time the house creaked. Roscoe refused to settle down at the foot of the bed like he usually did. Instead, he moved to lay flat against the bedroom door, his nose sniffing continuously under the gap as if he were guarding against someone standing right out in the hallway. I began to shift from a vague, paranormal fear to a much more terrifyingly real sensation. It was the spine-chilling feeling that a flesh-and-blood pair of eyes was actually watching my every move in the dark. On Saturday morning, I woke up with an exhausted and drained body after a sleepless night. I walked into the kitchen to find some water to wake myself up. When I opened the refrigerator door, I froze as I saw a brand new milk carton bought yesterday, its cap already unscrewed. The amount of milk inside had visibly dropped. I was 100% sure that I only drank plain water last night before going to bed. My panic started to grow as I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth. I picked up my toothbrush and realized the bristles were still damp. It had also been shifted slightly from my usual placement habit. I tried to reassure myself that maybe I was just being scatterbrained due to stress and lack of sleep. But as I walked past the old storage room at the end of the hallway, a strange odor hit me right in the face. It was the faint smell of cigarette smoke still lingering in the air, the kind of cheap, pungent tobacco that neither I nor Gideon had ever used. In a panic, I immediately called Gideon to tell him everything. Just as I expected, he sounded incredibly skeptical on the other end of the line. Gideon clicked his tongue and explained in a calm voice, "Maybe an electrician or the previous owner had been inside the house and left the smell, and you probably drank the milk in the middle of the night without remembering it." His rigid rationality did not make me feel any less scared. Instead, it made me feel even more isolated and anxious. By late Saturday afternoon, another piece of technological evidence appeared, completely turning my thoughts upside down. My phone suddenly vibrated and displayed a notification from the home's power consumption tracking app. When I opened the chart to check, I was horrified to find that the electricity usage spiked unreasonably between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. That was the exact time frame when I was lying still in bed, and every single light in the house was completely off. I grabbed a flashlight to inspect the main breaker panel located in the hallway wall recess. All the switches were normal, with no signs of short-circuiting or electrical overload. That proved a device somewhere in this house had been actively turned on while I was fast asleep. My mind fell into a state of utter crisis and extreme paranoia. I could no longer tell if I was facing a supernatural phenomenon or a lurking creep. To protect myself, I began to frantically engage in defensive behaviors. I went around the house to tightly lock all the windows and pull the curtains completely shut. I double-checked and triple-checked the deadbolts on the front door to make sure no one could get in from the outside. Before stepping into the bedroom, I reached out and grabbed a wooden baseball bat left under the cabinet to use as a self-defense weapon. Saturday night fell, bringing with it a suffocating and intensely tense atmosphere. Roscoe lay at the foot of the bed, but he did not close his eyes to sleep at all. He kept tilting his head up, staring intently at the bedroom ceiling, with his ears pricked up. The fur on the back of his neck stood completely on end, and he continuously let out fearful whimpers. The loyal dog's behavior acted as a definitive confirmation that my fears were right. The threat was not far away. It was right above my head, separated only by a thin layer of drywall. The clock struck exactly 3:39 in the morning on Sunday. I was sitting alone at the dining table in the kitchen, trying to stay awake to cross-reference the batch of unusual power consumption bills. The surroundings were so deathly quiet that I could hear my own heart thumping violently against my chest. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the old storage room at the end of the hallway. I held my breath, my entire body freezing as I listened for the security chime at the front door. The house remained completely silent, with no automated beep sound echoing, proving no one had broken in from the outside. But right after that, unmistakable rustling, dragging footsteps started echoing from inside the wall. That ghastly sound moved along the double-wall structure, heading straight toward the kitchen where I was sitting. I froze right in my tracks, my body totally paralyzed by a horrific realization that suddenly hit me. The enemy wasn't out there. He had been inside this house the entire time. Even before I first stepped foot here, in a state of sheer panic, I frantically grabbed my phone to call the police for help. But in that exact life-or-death moment, the screen suddenly glitched and turned into a pitch-black, lifeless void. The phone system had failed completely, stripping away my only chance of communication. Right above my head, from the metal grate of the air vent on the kitchen ceiling, a heavy, wheezing breath echoed, accompanied by a low, muffled cough from a strange man. I gathered the very last bit of my courage to look up. Through the small gaps of the metal grate, under the dim kitchen light, a pair of bloodshot eyes was staring straight down at me. I started screaming in pure terror, "Go away." I dropped the baseball bat onto the floor, grabbed Roscoe, and bolted straight out the front door to escape. I rushed into my car, slamming and locking the glass windows to isolate myself safely. I used the emergency call system in the car to contact the police. About 15 minutes later, the police showed up promptly at the scene, sirens blaring across the suburbs. The police officers quickly drew their weapons and began searching every single nook and cranny inside the house. In the old storage room, they discovered a hidden entrance concealed behind a wooden built-in wardrobe. This passageway led straight up to the attic and the empty crawl spaces running between the double walls of the house. The police found a filthy mattress, my empty milk cartons, and dozens of cheap cigarette butts scattered around. Even more sickening, there were small holes drilled through the ceiling to look straight down into the rooms below. That was the longtime hiding spot of a Frogger, a homeless man showing signs of severe psychological instability. He had been secretly living off me, moving and going about his life right above my head every single time I fell fast asleep. Environmental evidence showed the creep had managed to slip out through the roofline the moment he heard the police sirens from afar. He left behind a raw, chilling, and deeply haunting crime scene for the authorities. As soon as the police finished writing up their report at the scene, I immediately put Roscoe in the car and drove straight to my parents' house. I swore to myself that I would never set foot in that horrific house for another single second. Around noon on Sunday, Gideon rushed back from his business trip and was completely shell-shocked by what the police had left behind. He held me tight to comfort me, trying to use logic to ease the absolute terror inside me. Gideon kept saying that the man had only hidden in the attic and never actually came down to touch me. But the reality that a total stranger had been sharing my milk, using my toothbrush, and watching me sleep every single night was more than enough to break my mind. We decided to break the lease on that house immediately, accepting the loss of our entire security deposit. I insisted on finding a high-rise apartment with strict 24/7 security and a gated entrance. Life gradually returned to its normal routine after that. Gideon never dared to mock or laugh at my unseen fears ever again. That isolated house in suburban Pennsylvania was later sealed up and has stood abandoned ever since. The mystery of the man from that night remains completely open-ended, without any satisfying answer. Local police later informed me that they never caught the man with the bloodshot eyes who had been hiding in the walls. Looking back from the present day, almost 3 years have passed since that terrifying night in the summer of 2023. I still cannot escape the massive psychological shadow that the incident left in my mind. Whenever I walk into a new room or a new space, my very first instinct is always to stare up at the air vents. I will physically knock on the drywall just to make absolutely sure there are no empty spaces hidden behind them. I want to close my story with a chilling warning for everyone listening to this podcast. Tonight, before you turn off the lights and go to sleep, stand up and double-check your closets and the dark corners of your home, because you will never know for sure whether you are truly alone in the room. Even to this day, I still can't shake that spine-chilling feeling from that night. Even though I moved away a long time ago, every time I hear the wind howling through the window cracks at night, I wake up with a start. The pitch-black room suddenly feels suffocating, and cold sweat just pours down. It was a terrifying event, a toxic memory that completely shattered my sense of security and changed my life forever. It all started about 2 years ago, when I scraped together enough money to rent a small ground-floor apartment. The apartment was in a rundown, heavily dilapidated complex isolated in a windy suburb. Because of my tight budget, I accepted a living space with many inconveniences without a second thought. My large living room window faced a dark, dead-end alley that smelled of mold year-round and had almost no foot traffic. The only light in that alley was a dim streetlight, but it was always broken or flickering month after month. That gloomy and isolated setting inadvertently left me completely vulnerable. I had a terrible habit back then that I only realized later just how dangerous it was. I rarely drew the living room blinds all the way when the lights were on at night, simply because I thought the alley was hidden and nobody would bother to look. I freely walked around, ate, worked, and lived my life in front of that large glass pane, completely unaware that I was exposing my entire privacy to the outside world. Furthermore, the complex was so old that strange noises had become a normal part of daily life. Stray cats rummaging through the trash created loud clanking sounds, and dry tree branches tapped against the glass whenever a strong wind blew by. All that background noise happened regularly every night, repeating over and over until my guard was completely lowered. I was so used to ignoring the minor annoyances around me, taking them for granted, and completely losing my sense of alertness. That was my biggest weakness, a vulnerability that paved the way for the real nightmare to strike. Late one night, early in the week, I was lounging on the sofa watching a TV show. Glancing out the window by chance, I suddenly noticed something unusual. Under the flickering glow of the broken streetlight in the dead-end alley, a figure stood completely still. It was a tall, thin man wearing a dark hoodie. He stood as rigid as a wooden statue, his head slightly bowed, but his vacant stare was fixed directly on my living room. That lifeless stare sent a slight chill down my spine, but then I told myself to shake off the fear, thinking, it's probably just some drunk guy from a nearby bar who wandered in here. I decided to turn off the TV, draw the blinds slightly, and head straight to my bedroom to ignore him. Little did I know, a deadly danger had already locked onto me from that very moment. For the next 3 consecutive nights, the exact same thing happened in a deeply haunting way. That same dark figure kept appearing in the exact same spot under the broken streetlight, but at increasingly later hours. One night it was 1 a.m. Another night it was nearly 3 a.m. To keep myself from panicking, I constantly searched for the most logical explanations possible. I reassured myself that, since this alley was a shortcut to the bus stop on the main road, it made sense for someone to be waiting for a friend or catching a late ride. However, things began to leave physical traces, no longer lingering as just a vague, distant stare. On Thursday morning, when I went to the living room to crack the window for some fresh air, I was startled to find faint muddy tracks printed on the concrete windowsill outside. The mud was smeared messily against the dusty glass, looking crude, as if someone had just tried to grip it with their hands. The budding suspicion in my mind was quickly dismissed by my logic with another familiar excuse. It must have been stray cats jumping up and clinging to the glass looking for food last night. I told myself that, wiped the stain clean with a cloth, and didn't give it another thought. Yet, the dark figure's appearances in the alley grew more frequent, and his behavior began to shift. The next night, he was no longer standing far away under the broken streetlight. He had moved much closer, standing right against the wall, just a few paces away from my living room window glass. From the darkness of my room, I could faintly see that tall, thin shadow stretching across the alley ground. His silence, combined with how incredibly close he was standing, made the air inside the house turn thick and suffocating. Every excuse in my head completely shattered, giving way to a stark certainty that a predator was silently mapping out a plan to target me. By the 6th night, all my endurance and doubts were pushed into sheer terror. As I sat working late at my computer desk, the surroundings were so silent that I could clearly hear the ticking of the clock. Suddenly, a strange sound broke the silence. It was the sound of coarse fabric rubbing very softly, very slowly against the rusty security bars right outside the living room window. My entire body froze, and my heart hammered violently inside my chest. I slowly raised my eyes to look out, and was horrified by a chilling sight. That tall, thin man was hunching down, trying to press his dark face against the tiny gap in the unclosed blinds. The distance was so close that I could see his shadow etched sharply onto the fabric. The sound of his wheezing, ragged, and heavy breathing echoed distinctly through the thin glass in the dead of night. I realized that all the bizarre occurrences over the past week were absolutely not coincidental. It was a carefully calculated sequence of actions, a deliberate hunting process by a psychopath. The threat was no longer far away under the streetlight or by the wall. He had advanced right up to the only barrier protecting my life. Panic spiked to its absolute peak before I could even gather my wits to step backward. A sharp, dry click echoed from the windowsill. The perpetrator was using some kind of tool to pry open the old, loose window latch of the apartment. Only seconds later, the window slowly shifted, creeping open inch by inch in a deeply eerie manner. A gust of freezing night air, heavy with the stench of mold from the dead-end alley, rushed straight into the living room, blowing the edge of the curtain wide open. By this point, I knew I could no longer deceive myself with any excuses or reassurances. The predator had officially broken through my final line of defense and begun invading my living space. My hands shook violently, and I dropped my laptop onto the floor, completely disregarding the noise. I immediately grabbed my cell phone, unlocked it, and quickly dialed the 3 digits of the emergency police line, 911. I tried to whisper my apartment address into the receiver while hyperventilating from pure fear, The moment I hung up, my ears rang as I caught another sickening sound. It was the sound of bare, mud-slicked feet slowly stepping over the windowsill and onto the hardwood floor of the living room. In desperation, I quickly grabbed a small iron rod, a broken table leg from the corner of the room. To use as a weapon, all safe options were gone. I was forced into survival mode, bracing myself to face the intruder head-on. I didn't have enough time to run toward the front door because the distance was too far. In a state of sheer panic, I had no choice but to dash straight into the nearest bathroom and lock the door tightly. My breathing was rapid, and my chest tightened painfully from fear. Only a few seconds later, I heard the sound of bare, mud-covered feet moving slowly in the living room. The squelching, wet sound of soles stepping on the hardwood floor advanced closer and closer. I held my breath, my entire body trembling as I pressed my back hard against the bathroom door. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door, separating me by only a thin layer of wood. A terrifying, long fingernail scratching sound scraped against the wood, making a sickening screech. Right after that, his raspy, ghostly whisper echoed, "The blinds are drawn too tight today." I collapsed onto the floor, slapping both hands over my mouth to stop any sobbing from escaping. The doorknob began to twist violently, over and over, the metal clanking loudly. The psychopath put his weight into the door, trying hard to push it open from the outside. The extreme tension and terror pushed my survival instincts to their absolute limit. I gripped the iron rod tightly in my hand, preparing for the worst possible outcome. Suddenly, police sirens wailed out in the street after 15 minutes that felt as long as a century. Flashing red and blue lights flickered through the ventilation slot, illuminating a corner of the room. The police officers kicked the front door open, storming into the living room and shouting loudly. Hearing the commotion, the psychopath immediately fled through the window. Trembling, I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out with the officers, completely out of my mind with shock. When we turned on the lights to examine the scene, a horrifying sight struck my eyes. On the large mirror hanging in the bathroom, there was a message hastily written in smudged mud. "The blinds are drawn too tight today." My mind went completely blank, and my limbs turned to jelly as I realized the absolute absurdity of this. If he had been outside the living room, scratching the door, how could he have written that message on the mirror inside this bathroom? An officer approached the bathtub area in the corner of the room with a highly alert expression. He violently yanked open the thick fabric shower curtain. Behind the curtain, messy mud stains were smeared onto the edge of the tub, and a few strands of dirty hair were left behind. All the clues instantly snapped together, forming a sickening truth that made me freeze down to my bones. That man was not out in the living room at all when I ran to hide. He had sneaked through the window into the house during the afternoon, before I even got home, then hid right behind this shower curtain all evening. When I frantically rushed into the bathroom and locked the door, I had willingly locked myself inside the exact same room with the perpetrator. He had been standing right behind me in the darkness, watching me cry and scream through the gap in the curtain, then silently wrote that message on the mirror before slipping out through the living room window when the police burst in. The police conducted a thorough investigation of the apartment scene that very night. In the bathtub area, they found a sharp, rusty switchblade dropped underneath. Along with it was a hidden, miniature recording device that had been cleverly disguised. That device had been attached by him to the gap in the living room blinds a week prior to silently monitor my entire schedule. Thinking back to the moment I sat huddled up crying in the bathroom, I shudder with chills all over again. I realized I had shared the same space and been so close to death without even knowing it. If I had tried to use the iron rod to confront him earlier, or if law enforcement had arrived just 2 minutes later, I certainly would have become an unfortunate victim lying cold on the bathroom floor. The distance between fragile safety and a bloody disaster had never been so short. The very next morning, I immediately packed up all my personal belongings and moved somewhere else. I chose to leave behind some furniture and pay a lease termination fee just to escape that cursed apartment. To this day, the case remains open by the police because the perpetrator's actions were too elusive and sophisticated. He used a fake identity online and always obscured his face with a hoodie whenever he appeared. 2 years have passed, and my life has gradually returned to its normal track in a new state. However, the psychological scar left by that horrific night remains fully intact with no way to erase it. I never dare to be careless or dismiss unusual things happening around me anymore. Every faint noise at night, every fleeting glance from a stranger makes me jump in defense. I constantly reason to myself that maybe he is still lurking out there somewhere, looking for a new prey. This painful lesson will follow me for the rest of my life. Your complacency and habit of ignoring minor signs is exactly the perfect opening for ruthless predators in the dark to step in. I packed up everything I owned and fled the state of Ohio within 24 hours of that horrifying night. I walked away from a 3-month rent deposit and paid a massive contract penalty just to buy my own safety. My friends told me I was overreacting, but they didn't experience the sheer disgust of facing what was actually happening inside my home. How long had he been in there? That question haunts my mind every single night and ensures I will never look back at that house again. What could drive a man who thrives on quiet and stability to run for his life into a freezing storm? I want to tell this story to warn you that sometimes a tiny window sitting right at ground level can be the entrance to an absolute nightmare. I'm a freelance data analyst in my late 20s, a job that allows me to work from home all day. I'm a pretty private person. I've always preferred solitude and feel most comfortable when I don't have to socialize with the world. My living situation back then was a cheap basement apartment at the end of a dead-end road in a small Ohio town. My daily routine was incredibly monotonous. I regularly stayed up late working on my computer and only went to sleep when it was almost dawn. The basement had these very small glass windows positioned right at ground level, looking directly out into the thick, damp grass in the backyard. I told myself that renting a basement unit like this was just a smart way to cut down on living costs. To me, it was the perfect setup, completely normal, safe, and entirely free of any red flags. Everything began to change one morning, after a heavy rainstorm lasted all night in town. I walked into the kitchen to brew some coffee, like I did every day before sitting down to work. As I stepped up to the porcelain sink, I suddenly noticed a faint mud smudge and a few blades of dried grass stuck right on the rim. The sink happened to sit directly underneath that small glass window, looking out into the overgrown backyard. The anomaly was so minor at the time that it didn't trigger any fear in me at all. It just disrupted my normal routine a tiny bit, because I had to waste time grabbing a towel to wipe it clean. Must be some stray cats from the yard again. I mumbled to myself and quickly brushed it off to fix breakfast. I immediately looked for a harmless explanation, rationalizing that an animal was probably trying to shelter from the rain and scratched at the glass. I also told myself that I might have carelessly spilled some soil from the small potted plant nearby without remembering it. I went right back to my busy data analysis work and completely forgot about the strange mud stain. But my peaceful world didn't last very long. About a week later, after another night of pouring rain, that damp mud streak appeared again in the exact same spot the next morning. This time, the scratch marks on the sink rim were more prominent, and the wild grass blades were still soaking wet, as if they had just been carried in from outside. I stood there staring at the kitchen corner for a few minutes, feeling slightly confused, but I was still completely blind to the reality. The signs began to repeat more frequently after every heavy downpour that swept through this deserted neighborhood. The tension was building, but my mindset was still stuck at mere annoyance over this ridiculous nuisance. I carelessly kept staying up late, working until 3 or 4 in the morning, only writing a sticky note to paste on my computer monitor. Need to go to the store and buy a roll of tape to seal up those window gaps. I constantly found logical reasons to dismiss the growing sense of unease that was slowly taking root in my heart. Things took a terrifying turn late one rainy night, around 2 in the morning, while I was focused on my computer. Out of the pitch-black kitchen next door, a strange noise broke the heavy silence of the basement. It was a prolonged dragging sound, like something wet rubbing and sliding slowly against the drywall. Froze instantly, the breath catching in my throat as I realized this sound was definitively coming from inside the house, not outside. There is no way that's a cat. It's way too heavy and clear. I completely doubted my initial theory about the stray cat, or the wind blowing through the window cracks. My mindset instantly shifted from mild annoyance to pure, visceral dread. The next morning, I grabbed a small flashlight to inspect the window from the overgrown backyard. Standing in the freezing drizzle, I bent low to the muddy ground to closely examine the basement window's security screen. The initial inspection revealed no clear evidence of a break-in. From the outside, the metal screen appeared perfectly intact, showing no signs of being pried open. This didn't bring me any peace of mind. Instead, my fear multiplied because of the sheer mystery of it. If the window isn't broken, where are those mud streaks coming from? The silence of the house grew suffocating and terrifying. Over the next 2 days, I noticed a chain of other anomalies happening simultaneously in my tiny kitchen. The dish sponge was still damp and smelled of an unfamiliar cologne in the morning, even though I was certain I hadn't touched it since the night before. The broom, which I always kept propped up in the left corner, was mysteriously tilted all the way to the right side. More small details kept popping up, like a fresh scratch mark on the hardwood floor and a faint stench of wet, dirty clothes lingering in the air. All those minor pieces of evidence began piecing together into a horrifying picture. It hit me that someone was subtly moving my things around whenever I wasn't paying attention. Someone got inside. He's right here with me. I was completely helpless and could no longer explain these occurrences through natural causes or normal coincidences. Every optimistic thought I previously held completely shattered. From this moment on, my life officially entered a suffocating new phase, one where I had to figure out how to survive. It was a night of torrential rain, and I lay in bed with my eyes wide open in the dark, filled with a restless anxiety. A faint clicking sound, the familiar snap of the window latch, echoed from the kitchen and sent chills down my spine. I quietly slid out of bed, leaving the lights off, and tried to move soundlessly toward the cracked open bedroom door. I peered through the narrow gap, barely 2 centimeters wide, focusing my eyes on the dark expanse of the kitchen. Dim streetlights filtered through the basement window, shining directly on the silhouette of a large man sitting flat on the kitchen floor. A tiny detail caught my eye. He was holding my actual broom, meticulously wiping away every single streak of water and mud on the floor. He backed up slowly toward the window, moving with a calm professionalism, as if he had successfully pulled this off dozens of times before. The biggest shock was his face, completely calm and cold as he erased all evidence of his break-in, while I slept just a few feet away. He knows I'm here. That thought raced down my spine, leaving me completely paralyzed for a few agonizing seconds. Pure terror kept me from making a sound or foolishly rushing out to confront the mysterious man. I stepped back carefully, turning the bedroom door lock as slowly as possible to avoid making any noise. I immediately grabbed my cell phone and car keys from the nightstand. I decided to climb out of my bedroom window. Throwing myself into the mud and pouring rain on the other side of the house, I ran like hell to my old car, cranked the engine, and sped off toward a 24-hour gas station about 3 miles away. Sitting in the car, soaking wet with my hands shaking violently, I dialed 911 to report the emergency. Just 15 minutes later, 3 police cruisers arrived and began searching my entire basement apartment. The scene investigation immediately confirmed that my danger was completely real and extremely severe. The police discovered physical evidence. The security screen on the kitchen window had been cleanly cut open with a utility knife a long time ago. On the kitchen counter, they found a small black plastic camera lens cap, an object that didn't belong to me. This discovery explained how he knew my exact daily routine, but at the same time, it opened up a flood of terrifying new questions. The police couldn't find a single fingerprint on the broom handle or the sink, because the intruder had been careful enough to wear gloves. As soon as dawn broke, I immediately hired a moving truck to pack up all my belongings and get out of that nightmare basement. I moved permanently into a 3rd-floor apartment in a bustling complex right in the heart of a major city. I spent a fortune installing motion sensors and a dense network of security cameras at every entrance of my new place. Right now, I am dealing with severe trauma and chronic insomnia that makes me panic every single time it rains. I have developed a new routine where I must walk around the entire place, checking the door locks exactly 3 times before going to bed. Did I actually lock it tight tonight? That thought loops continuously in my head like a vicious curse whenever darkness falls. The ordeal is technically over since I completely abandoned the old house and no longer face an immediate threat. However, my life will never have a complete explanation or absolute peace of mind. The local police later moved my case into the cold case files because there were no further leads or witnesses. The mysterious intruder with the camera is still out there at large. His true identity buried in the dark, I often come up with a chilling personal theory that the man had been secretly stalking me long before he made his move. Maybe he was a creep who caught a glimpse of me at a department store, quietly followed me home, and realized I lived entirely alone. I can never verify whether that is true, and that leaves a relentless haunting in my mind every night. I want to close my story with a harsh lesson for anyone who takes their home security for granted. Never ignore small smudges or the slightest changes inside your home, because out there are always people willing to patiently crawl through the mud just to sit in silence and watch you sleep in the dark.